Je vais demander à 𝗖𝗔𝗗𝗥𝗘 de...
And I'd like 𝗖𝗔𝗗𝗥𝗘 to come and join me up here on stage. She is a professor of agronomy at the Agro Institute in Rennes and Angers. And also, I believe you are linked to Sichuan in China. You're elected chair of the European Agronomic Society and a member of the board. And you're also a member of the working group for Europe Innovation Partnership, Carbon, from the source to the well. So you do a lot. You're also a member of the Strategic Committee for the Foundation for Research in France, working on agroecology and transition and agroforestry. So I believe you're going to talk us about the design of agrosystems which could be deemed resilient. Hello, everybody. I am delighted to be with you today in order to talk about resilience. Resilience, then, resilience of our agroecosystems. In order to talk about resilience, I want to give you an initial image here, which you could see perhaps as a bit of countryside with mountains and valleys, etc. And I want to use this image because it allows me to show you that the agroecosystems, like any other natural ecosystem, they have several functioning states. So somebody could be working at the bottom of the valley, and this is, you can see it, the black dot. It works well. It's going to supply a certain number of processes. And then there's another zone which allows us to understand that the functioning is going to change from one year to another, from 1 month to another sometimes. But we're still going to remain within the scope of something fairly regular. And how can you explain that? Well, because there are stabilizing processes which allow the maintenance, the stability of this ecosystem in spite of all fluctuations. Now, these stabilizing processes, well, you've heard about biodiversity, but there's not only that in terms of number of species, but we're looking at species that we're going to group together because they have the same ecological role. You could take two crops who could have the same ecological function of, supplying organic material, but they're going to be very different from leguminous crops. So we're going to make this distinction between the number of species and the number of species grouped together, which bring about any kind of ecological function. We're also going to look at the interaction between the species and how they regulate amongst themselves, how they work. We're going to look at the stabilizing mechanisms, synchronism of different species, or some species which are very sensible, but then you've got one that's less sensible, is going to stabilize. Working together, they're going to stabilize. If you consider functional biodiversity, they have the same effect on the agroecosystem, and the function continues to work. And of course, there's connectivity, the number of connections between the various species. However, that's the little image. Bear that in mind. It's interesting to understand how the system is stabilized, because when it functions like this, I'm going to be able to associate different services to this. You have the black dot, and then you have different petals which represent a system which help in the correct functioning of the ecosystem. Here you can have regulation of water quality or air quality. They're the two opposing petals. And then you can also have an ecosystemic service, which is looking at the soil and erosion, limiting erosion. And you have another petal, which is yield. And when you have a stable system, this is interesting because, well, we can almost predict the ecological performance and the social economic performance of the agroecosystem. So we can anticipate, of course, investment. The issue is, because of climate change, and this is an example of a crisis, but we have other crises which could be included or used in order to talk about resilience. The system, follow the little black dot, it's being pushed out of its comfort zone, out of its attraction zone, out of normality. So it has a certain capability to buffer the shock and to continue to work. So if you look at the extreme climatic phenomena, come droughts or intense rain, as you've had in the northwest of France, these are real problems, issues which occur frequently. These extremes that create prolonged areas, prolonged periods of instability, and this is going to push the ecosystem towards another attraction basin because it's not got the same ecological functions and it cannot work as it once did. So if you transfer towards another state of functioning, and this is a critical function, a critical transition, so the ecosystem is going to be in an irreversible situation and we will never be able to come back to the way it functioned before and the services that we expected it. So if you look at the green zone, this then is a zone which allows us to maintain the agroecosystem in spite of these extreme shocks. As ecosystems which are unfamiliar for this ecosystem. Now, the challenge of our research is to define this space under two different systems of functioning so you can avoid being transferred into another state which is considered irreversible. And here you're going to see all the difficulties of research on resilience because the stabilizing mechanisms are already extremely complex. However, the resilience mechanisms are more delicate and more difficult to identify because they are born of interaction. They are going to be born of the interaction between the soil and the plants, and between them, the plants and the microorganisms. And you have this analogy of the retroaction ball. And when you talk about resilience, you have to work on synchronization between the role of the soil and the way that the plants function. This is linked through the root systems, by the litter, and by the images we saw earlier. So you have these metronomic images. How can we synchronize? Should we synchronize, or is synchronizing going to be of any interest? And with extreme climate phenomena, we're only looking at one part of the ecosystem. We're looking at the soil. So we could say we're going to do as much as we can to encourage soil resilience, but then you're forgetting that it's connected to the plants and, of course, beyond plants, the microorganisms, etc. You have to find the right challenges and the right balances, but of course we must ask the right questions. So I'm hammering on a bit about the complexity there for a reason. There are other phenomena which we highlight in the literature. And this is the inheritance and conditioning phenomena. These are the plants which are going to condition how the soil works. They're going to bring organic matter to the table. They're going to change the different structure of communities. You're going to have an imbalance between any pathogens and anything that's breaking down the soil. And we call that conditioning, deconditioning. And when you have a climate phenomena, the ground, the soil, remembers what happens, so it's going to have to deal with inheritance and conditioning in order to understand how the resilience of agroecosystems actually works. Now, how can we lose resilience? Well, we can lose it in different ways. First, perhaps by changing the attraction, the basin of attraction. If you look at agricultural practices, particularly in systems where we can't have any crop rotation, well, the practices that are going to increase or encourage the lack of biodiversity and encourage soil compaction or increase the level of contamination are going to destroy this basin of attraction. We're losing the stabilizing mechanisms, but we're also losing the mechanisms which are the basis of resilience. So you could really find yourself in the light of this destruction of the attraction basin through practices. We are going to push forward this change of an ecosystem towards another one, which is going to be completely different by definition. And what we see with this climate phenomena and the different phenomena, you have the destruction or deformation of the basin and climate phenomena which push us towards new agroecosystems. And we have around that all of the other challenges, which we call the black signs in the financial world. It's a term that's used, and that's events, the unknown. Everything that's going to happen, but we can't predict. They are the unknown factor. So the objective of resilience is to bear in mind the current issues, certainly, but also to try and understand what's going to happen, the events that are going to have shock waves through the ecosystemic world. And if we've moved into these new systems, we have systems which are, by definition, more vulnerable. And this vulnerability is going to be variable depending on the size of farms. And it's not necessarily the smallest ones that are going to be the most or the least resilient and the bigger ones that are going to be the most resilient. That's not necessarily the case. Now, if you have investment and if you're able to anticipate, well, we're going to perhaps move into new functioning, or if we don't anticipate, there's going to be volatility in the market, and we're going to have mental health issues for farmers and producers, because there is this uncertainty which generates anxiety. So therefore, it is essential to generate a future for these agroecosystems, a future which is resilient and desirable. So to maintain this margin for maneuver, always focusing on resilience, it is essential to identify the dependencies, all of these keys, all these locks which prevent us from unlocking an ecosystem. Here you have two people who are talking, one who wants absolutely to remain on the trodden path and has some very good reasons for doing so. Although just beside that, there's a path which is going to allow you not to run into the wall, but he's ignoring it. So what are the locks that we've encountered? Well, there's technological ones, organizational ones, lack of coordination between actors. There are political ones linked to the lack of any kind of incentive, often with a lack of long-term visibility. And there's, of course, you have the scientific ones, because there's a lack of R&D. And there we're going to see a dominant situation, which is not the best, but it's the most difficult to leave. So imagine now a desirable future, shall we? This is a challenge which is linked to us and to our capability to imagine it. Here you have the representation of the future. You're going to have to imagine what's going to happen tomorrow. You have different futures possible. You have this huge possibility in front of you of future. You can take out all of that's impossible and keep the possible. And you have to choose the ones that are going to be desirable. We're going to have to shape them now, making no mistakes. Because once you've decided on a path, you can't say, we should have done things differently, because it's extremely difficult to turn foot and start again. So we have to imagine these desirable futures with long-term protection, and this is linked to the human capacity, because it's very difficult for us to project on the long term. But we are one of the few species that can actually imagine a desirable future. So why are we doing that? Why are we working on that in my R&D group? Well, we're mixing approaches that are going to encourage abstraction. And to do that, we need new methods, we need new research approaches, and in particular, we need approaches which are going to mix science, knowledge from the field, and artistic practice. Now, I'll give you a short example of the work that's going to be defended very shortly by 𝗟'𝗜𝗄𝗏. We created workshops of co-design. Now, what is that? Well, this is the image in the middle. And in this workshop, you have a preparatory phase. You have the international basis of all the plants. And we looked at the plants that were more likely to encourage long-term resilience. We created a card game. And you can see that you've got arable crops here, but this allowed us to transfer all of the literature onto very practical physical supports, cards, and we could look at the results. And we had a pool of 60 species, which we gave to participants. They were already grouped together. We had farmers, we had researchers, we had advisors, and we asked them then to design a complex rotation using a scenario which allowed them to get out of what they do on a daily basis, but still keeping a link with reality. So we came up with a scenario which is kind of like role play, where we asked people to, you're on a desert island and you find a box of seeds which correspond to the cards you have. What you have to do then is imagine a crop rotation that you can put in place. You have to, innovate what you're going to do. So we had some very interesting results. They chose only 39 species from the pool, and then they jointly designed this rotation. And the rotation, there were two rotations. You can see them, 𝗟'𝗏𝗏 1 and 𝗟'𝗏𝗏 2, tomorrow and rotation combined, of course, and we compared this to existing rotations in the region. We were in Brittany. We had a rotation much like we have every year, and one that was supposed to be the rotation which was supposed to be as diversified as possible, because it corresponded to one in which we could grow crop systems without using any pesticides at all. And what we saw looking at the biodiversity index, that the jointly created index through this workshop was far more diverse. So to test this rotation, which was conceived in the workshop, we simulated over 60 years the two rotations, and then we looked at what the compromise might be between the ecosystemic services. We experimented in silico. The goal of this kind of approach is, instead of experimenting on different parcels and maintaining this experience over the long term, and that's not possible because it's very costly, well, we explore using different soil plant models, which are the result of 60 years of R&D and work. We try and test them all together. Now let's talk about agroforestry. Agroforestry is really well situated in this project that I've been talking about. This is supposed to favorize the stabilizing mechanism. You have your tree, you have plants, you have an animal, you have the water cycle, the organic matter, and you have the effects of the presence of the tree, the reduction of evaporation, and that's encouraged by the structure and the volume of the canopy. Infiltration is permitted by the root system, etc. And what you have in blue is what we call the functional lines. This is what we would observe quite normally on a plant, and what we can use to predict the agroecosystem. And the same thing for the organic material. So that's very theoretical. Now let's look at what the literature says. When you plant a tree, there are changes in the soil properties, and this study looked at the modification of the content in carbon and magnesium in the parcel. If you look at the what's happening, they've cut the soil. I suppose you have an image of what's happening when the soil is cut into, and you can compare that with the zone, the blue zone, which is the area that doesn't have a tree on it. So you can see there is a modification of the properties because the tree is there, but not for all the elements. And the tree is the beneficial effects of the tree remain quite localized. So the challenge is then the following. We have to try and use all of the options that nature allows us, trees, but what else? It's good to have this area where it's sure that the agroecosystem is going to work. Well, you can't just plant a tree. You have to design an agroforestry system combining plants, whether the perennials or not, and agricultural practices, because it's with this interaction that we're going to really encounter benefits. If you can see for agroforestry, is that We have now a great many pieces of literature in which, and we've seen what's in place around France and elsewhere. We can see there's prevention of soil erosion, loss of nutrients, etc. They're all working, but there's all different variations in terms of the service depending on the type of agroforestry we're talking about. And here you have a definition of all the solutions based in nature. These are actions which use the ecosystems in order to answer the challenges. They rise to the challenges. And agroforestry is one of the solutions which is really firmly based in nature. Now, why do I keep saying one of the solutions? Well, because it's not the only one. It's not a miracle solution. It's one of the solutions. Now, in order to justify what I've just said, we have worked within the framework of a doctoral thesis. We tried to understand how we could explain the stability of nitrification, so the ammonium into nitrates. Now, it can be taken by the plants or filled into the hydrosystems. So we had a system approach, which is very different from what we do normally, where we compare one system with another. We look at the factor effect. This is very different. In our approach, what we've done is we've looked at the system in its entirety, going from the stability of nitrification underneath the tree, and that what happens when you get away from the tree, the further you get away. You can see the influence underneath the tree, but obviously that's going to diminish as it goes further away. And what's happening further away from the tree, and what's going to change when it gets closer to the roots of the tree. So nitrification, we really try to understand the variables which had the biggest influence on nitrification stability. In our case, after a great rainfall. I can give you the details at the break if you like. I don't want to get too bogged down in them just now, but what you must bear in mind that the stability of nitrification is very variable. The tree has a real influence. It stabilizes the nitrification process, but only when you're very close to the tree. So what you mustn't generalize. You have to, because the effect on the soil and the tree and the agroecosystemic design is very variable. You also have to be very careful with regards to a phenomenon which is extremely important, and that's acidification, which could take place and can take place near the trees. Why? Well, because you have the biological mechanisms which are very strong, and you can see in the forest systems you have this trend towards acidification, and you have to manage that. We have to monitor that, of course. And then we talk about agroforestry, and you heard it before from Daria, you have to talk about which tree. Here you have a simulation of trees which could remain in the future. It's a simulation which is fairly simplistic. Researchers who tried to see which trees could survive just using this precipitation gradient and temperature, and which ones could exist just with temperature and humidity, that gradient. And what we've noted is that the trees that we have today, or that we would plant today, when you look at the range possible, you have forest species, but in an intermediate climate scenario, we're not looking at extreme conditions. In an intermediate one, well, there are very few trees which are going to survive on the long term. If you want to plant trees which will survive a climatic future, we cannot plant them today because the climate isn't suited, and there are ones which are going to disappear absolutely, completely. So, agroforestry is one of the wonderful levers we can use to encourage resilience. But there's still a great many questions to be asked, and this is linked to the interactions that take place. We saw with the agronomic phenomena and the resilience, ecological resilience, there is great importance for the tree. But the tree can also make us think about the long term, and we need that. We need to be forced to think about abstraction. You have to imagine all of the possible situations for the future. Let's not think about what's going to happen tomorrow or in 5 years, but what's going to happen in 60 years. And studies have shown that the this tree can allow for this long-term projection by its very perennial nature. I mean, it can also encourage dialogue between people. Urban-rural continuums, etc. We know there's a great deal of tension sometimes between people who live in the town who are going to consume, that they really don't know how the countryside works, or how an agroeconomic system works, or an agroecosystem works, how a farm works. So studies have shown us that the tree can really promote, encourage this dialogue between the different players. And I have some sentences here from the work we've studied with producers. Here you can see the image in the picture in the middle, a farmer who said to us, planting trees allow me to create verticality, and I feel like my parcel is far prettier, and people actually ask me what I do here. Another farmer said to me, there were no trees left on the farm. I no longer heard the birds. Now I can hear them again. So testimony from people who are very much involved in this. And I talked about crises that we cannot anticipate. Hurricane Katrina, for example. People planted trees as a symbol of resilience and a symbol of continuity in their community.
We've already mentioned some hindrances. Yes, there are hindrances in agroforestry systems at the social, economic, financial, technological level. We have to address them, although the potential is here, but we have to keep documenting the agroforestry systems. And as I said, it's one of the possibilities. I would like to highlight the different ways of diversification of the agriculture. We have to speak about strong agroecology and diversification processes. I wanted to talk about something that is not directly linked with agroforestry, but still has meaning. We looked at the capacity of plants to change the environment around their roots, close environment. Plants are amazing and roots are amazing because they can actually change the system in the soil a few millimeters around their roots to gain more nutrients or protect themselves against pathogens. This is what we call the rhizosphere effect. If we use agroforestry, it has a rhizosphere effect as a whole. If you have a more complex rotation, i.e. diversification, the rhizosphere effect is increased because the more this rhizosphere effect happens, the more the roots can actually select exactly what it needs and actually different elements from what they would usually use. And when you think in terms of soil management, if you have a simplified work, it increases the rhizosphere effect. In my first example, we had a strong rhizosphere effect, but if you have crops that are not favorable to this rhizosphere effect, it decreases. So it's interesting to use at the species that can induce such a rhizosphere effect. We need to identify such species. And in the long run, we have challenges in terms of increased interactions between the soil sciences, agroecology, the improvement of varieties, and agroeconomy, so that all these aspects can come together as a jigsaw puzzle. And in terms of research, we need to change our practices and research methods. And I would like to conclude with this last slide. We talk about one crisis and then the next one comes up. So we should talk about polycrisis, the impossibility of solving one crisis without taking other crises to come into account, because it's a domino effect. There are repercussions in terms of climate anger or climate migrations. So we need a transformative resilience. We have to avoid the trap of rigidity. from a whole sector, for instance, but also the risks of resources, and we need to take every aspect into account to have transformative resilience. And if you want to know more after this presentation, feel free to get in touch with me. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you. It was a great scientific demonstration of the imperative to redesign agrosystems. I keep one message from your presentation: desirable future. It's about long-term perspectives. It's really what we have to look into in a detailed manner. I think it was a very dense presentation, very interesting presentation. I am therefore sure there are questions.
Vincent Xavier, Société 𝗟'𝗓𝗓.
Vincent Xavier from the 𝗟'𝗓𝗶𝘁𝗂𝘁 company. Thank you for this very dense presentation. I had a question regarding the beginning of your presentation, the non-reversibility of the critical transition. On the first, one of the first slides you showed. My question is, how do you demonstrate non-reversibility? In other words, if you have a transition or a change occurring, how do we conclude in a definite manner that it is irreversible? We defined a set of indicators, indexes, that must not be reached or passed over. We compare the past system and the current system. If we see that the performances that we used to have cannot be achieved anymore, that is a non-reversible state. This is what we measure.
Bonjour madame, 𝗟'𝗜ʰ𝘀𝗁𝗂𝗁 à nouveau, PMA 28.
I am a farmer from PMA 28, among other jobs. I really enjoyed your presentation. However, I think there is something missing. It's the profitability of the farming system. I actually encourage, if you want to encourage farmers to change their practices, you need to prove to them that they will keep the same level of income. Indeed, that is why I'm doing research in agronomy. When we assess a system, we always have economic and workload assessment. We never forget that aspect in our research. Besides, I think your question can be taken further. It's not only the stability or the optimization of yields, it's also the stability in the long run, because the questions that we have to face is that if one year you have a strong yield and the year after you have nothing, it is very difficult to manage. What we are looking for is stability over time with yields that are reproducible. We need to define together what yields we want and we need, and then to look at the different options. This is what I call desirable future, and how we can co-design them together. This is why this co-design workshop is key, because while we were together working on co-designing, some people would tell us, we can't reduce that, it's not possible, and therefore we came up with solutions. If we do that, is it better? Yes, no, and so on.
Oui, pour revenir sur vos ateliers de co-construction.
Back to your co-design workshops, tomorrow 1 and tomorrow 2, if I remember correctly. Can we access these results? Yes, so far we have the research publication that are available in English. The thesis is going to be presented soon, and we'll have a YouTube presentation, but it will depend on the stress level of the student, PhD student. There is room for discussion because we try to meet a maximum of people to present our results, but the dissemination of the results is very time-consuming, and we can't do as much as we wished. And I think it's part of the transformative resilience is dissemination of research. There is no confidentiality. This thesis was co-financed by 𝗟'𝗜𝗄𝗏 and the Agronomy Institute, so all the results will be public. 𝗟'𝗜𝗂𝗏 from the 𝗟'𝗜𝗏. Additional comment. We are working on research projects. We're trying to organize co-design workshops, but I think you're working a lot on yearly varieties. Do you have any knowledge of workshops on perennial varieties? We're really focusing on co-design. It's a method. This concept can be implemented on any system that you wish to co-design. It can be perennial crops, it can be anything. So we can adapt. The workshops for co-designing on perennial systems, I think, already exist. 𝗟'𝗜𝗏 probably leads some. We have some in our engineer projects and so on. Agroforestry systems actually have to be imagined as a growing system, and the ecologic functions in time can actually shift from neutral, when the tree is young, for instance, the interaction can be neutral or non-existing, up to facilitation, up to competition. So the management in the co-design workshop is about imagining the best design to adapt to these ecological interactions over time.
Oui, bonjour, moi je m'appelle François Duvaux.
My name is François Duvaux. I produce maps. I think your work is amazing, what you're doing with the 𝗟'𝗏𝗏. But I agree with my colleague regarding profitability. You are doing R&D. We also do R&D, and it's never taken into account in our price range. It's a real issue because we're number one to find solutions to adapt. We are, hand on the ground to do it, and we wish we could adapt locally all this research in our farms. A few of us were actually moved to tell us, when people told us that we didn't know anything about the field work. In our work, profitability is actually part of our research. We don't design beautiful systems. We design efficient and realistic systems. We need producers and farmers to actually make a living from these changes. And we need to renew generations as well. There are a lot of ecological advantages that can only be observed in time. And so we need to keep the motivation up of farmers. I have colleagues that work with economists in functional economy and soil science. There are collaborations, and we are looking into these aspects in our research. I'm sorry, I can't see you with the spotlights. I'm from Biosphere. Regarding the rhizosphere effect, what type of crop were you studying in that study? And how about the agronomic, the non-agronomic aspect of your research? In the rhizosphere, we're looking at several varieties because it's a method. The point is to measure the difference between soil influenced by roots, defined by volume per plant, and we compare with the entire soil non-influenced by roots. So in our study, we worked on wheat, what we called elite wheat. The selection actually cut off the interaction of the rhizome because we actually used the aerial parts. The root system was not sufficient to actually capture the nutrients in the soil. So we've designed a methodology on how to measure the rhizosphere effect. It was measured on a plot, not in a lab. So it is transferable, but of course we need to find projects to be financed to study other varieties. But we have the methodology anyway. Thank you. It was a very interesting presentation by Mrs. 𝗟'𝗜ʰ𝘀𝗁𝗏. Thank you. Round of applause.